welcome back to my channel. I'm here today again with Dillon Lange, and we are going to talk about silent films, which surprised me a little because it was a topic that Dillon suggested, and I didn't really know that anybody was into silent films so much anymore. But they are kind of cool. I've seen several. I've enjoyed them. So I'll let Dillon tell us a little bit about what he likes about them and why he wants to discuss them. Dillon?
Yeah, like you said, it is. It's not a thing that a lot of people really watch that often anymore, and that's what's kind of fascinating about them to me, from just watching or experiencing them, is that they're these films that kind of set the precedent and like the groundwork for where we ended up today with our films that tons of people watch, that not many people just watch willingly. You'll watch it if you're in a class for film or something. You're bound to see it because a lot of your auteur films are silent films usually. So the one with Salvador Dali, and Shen Andalou, something like that. That one is one that you're for sure going to be forced to watch if you take any sort of course in film. But no, it is an interesting topic. Just to talk about just the films themselves, because in some ways they were a lot. They faced censorship and had to. They couldn't get away with a lot of the things that we could get away with now, but in some cases they actually got away with quite a bit more than they would end up being able to get away with in the 30s to 60s kind of era. There's a lot of nudity in a lot of silent films, especially French ones. Your European silent films are going to have a lot more exploration of more Freudian concepts, I would say.
Well, they do have it's an entirely different style. And I know that when I start watching one, at the very beginning, I'll be thinking, oh, I don't know if I can sit through this. It's just so different from what I'm used to or whatever, and it's going to bore me. But, they did enough with the action and the way they acted. It is a different style of acting. But the ones I've seen, after a few minutes, it really draws you in, and then you kind of forget that you're reading these title cards, and you just watch the movie, and it's very enjoyable.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. I've always had this. So I like really long films, and I like black and white and silent films, but they are more of a commitment in a way, like your foreign films and your silent films, because you do have to be paying 100% attention most of the time. I think one of the reasons I'm so fascinated with silent film is that in order for me to hold on, I'm trying to properly put together what I'm trying to say. They're already working at a detriment because they are lacking the easy way to convey what's going on, which is dialogue. So they already have to double down on the visual and that's it. That's all they have to work with, really.
Right. And the cameras generally is pretty static. They've got a single camera. And I noticed, in Nosferatu, even though when they tell you it's nighttime, the vampire has a really distinct shadow, and it's well, clearly we're filming it, in bright daylight, but obviously the camera just couldn't handle shooting in the dark, right? So you just have to go with it and just understand there were very, very strict limits on what they could do technologically, and yet they did so many creative things with shadow and with movement, and that movie's really scary, really. I mean, the scene of his shadow coming up the stairs, and just him in the window, him standing on the deck of the ship.
Nosferatu gave me nightmares when I was a child.
It's
just
very
the images I saw.
Yeah.
I didn't see it until later in my life, in its completion, but just the images that would pop up in various places. He was freaky to me.
I think you can do a lot of symbolic things too, like in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, there's never a 90-degree angle anywhere.
Oh no!
Right? Because it takes place like in the mind of a madman, and so everything is kind of insane, and so nothing is square, nothing is plumb, nothing's right, and they just do that with the sets, and so because they can't do a lot with the camera, so they found other ways to get points across that are very, very creative.
One of the interesting things, but also like difficult things for a modern viewer to get into a silent film is that you have to approach them with the mindset that this was like the first thing to do that in a way. Like you were mentioning Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and how that takes place in the mind of this insane guy. That was one of the first films to really play with the idea of flashback, because it's got that framing device where it begins with the guy like at the hospital or something, and then it flashes back to what he experienced, and then we go back towards the end of the film. And that was one of the first films to really do that. And I think without that context and without keeping that in mind, a person coming in to watch it would go, I've seen all this stuff before, and it was more engaging in a sense. But I feel like, that's not the proper way to be viewing these kinds of films. And there's your famous ones like Nosferatu. A lot of people know Nosferatu just because of the image of Nosferatu, and because we've gotten like remakes or reimaginings of Nosferatu before.
There's a Klaus Kinski version, and then there was that version with Willem Dafoe was William Shrek or whatever. So I can't remember the name of that, Shadow of the Vampire or something.
Something along those lines.
Yeah. So we have, which references the shooting of the movie, right?
Yeah.
And the guys actually hired a real vampire to play a vampire.
Yeah.
So that movie does get mentioned in things, and it shows up other places.
Metropolis is another one that a lot of people know about. If they're just kind of interested in film, they might not have seen it, but it's a very influential film, and so it gets listed a lot in various like greatest movies of all time kind of lists. But there's some films that not a lot of people know about. I mean, so for like the first like 15 years of my life, to me, whenever you say Frankenstein or the original Frankenstein, you think of like the Boris Karloff one. There was actually a film produced by Thomas Edison in 1910. It's like a 13-minute long film, and it's based off of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's about the scientist who brings a creature to life, and antics ensue. And that's fascinating to me that one isn't lost, but it's almost lost in like the idea of public consciousness, because this more iconic one came out and just completely blew it out of the water like 20 years later. And no one really sees the need to go back to that 1910 version. But there's a lot of interesting things in that 1910 version, like the makeup effects that they did were really interesting. He looks a lot more like a trash monster almost. He almost looks like an evil version of Oscar the Grouch. But and the not transformation, but the resurrection sequence. Instead of it being like a dead body that he resurrects with like lightning and stuff, it's this pot, and he just dumps a bunch of chemicals in it, and out of it, I can only assume they lit like this like puppet or this model on fire, and then did it in reverse, or like played it in reverse, because like it just forms up, and then like it cuts to the scientist's reaction, and then cuts back, and it's a little bit more complete, and it's got this little wiggly arm probably being propped up with like a wire. And I find that just really interesting how that gets forgotten. On top of the fact that already like 90% of your silent era is thought to be just lost.
Hmm.
Um,
Wasn't the first Tarzan, Elmo Lincoln, wasn't that a silent? I can't remember. It was very, very early, but I don't remember how early.
Possibly. I'm not too sure about that. Well, I really like silent film, but I'm not an expert. I would say I'm interested in what it does, and I'm getting into it, and so I'm very much thinking about silent film right now, which is why I suggested the topic. Um, the the one of the more famous missing silent films, it stars Lon Chaney Sr., which was London After Midnight, and that was a film. If I remember correctly, the character that he portrays in that is one of the inspirations for the Joker, actually. Um, and so it's interesting that there's this very influential character from this film that is just almost completely missing. There was a reconstruction of it, like in the 60s or so, where they just took like existing stills and then they put like a score over it, and then they put descriptions about what's going on in between each still. And that's kind of interesting, but it is a shame that just this film is completely lost because someone was storing it in their attic whenever it burned down, and that was the only copy that we had in existence. And even the films that we do have, they're extremely worn down. If you watch that 1910 Frankenstein, you practically have to squint in some scenes to really understand like what you're looking at, with how grainy and how washed out the picture is. It's almost heartbreaking in my opinion, because I like film, and so it is heartbreaking to hear about things of that nature just disappearing and dying,
Mm-hmm.
being worn down. Um, the if I hold on, I have a little statistic up here. So Martin Scorsese's Film Foundation claims that apparently like half of the films made before 1950 are gone.
Wow.
But then also there's various people who say that like about 80 to 90% of the silent era is just gone. And missing film is just, that's almost another topic in and of itself, where you have there was a Japanese adaptation of King Kong around like sometime in the 30s, and I think that was lost due to World War II, like bombings or something destroyed the only copies that they had, and now all we have is like just one like newspaper ad about it, and so we have like a picture of the guy in the suit and then a description of it, but that's it. So yeah, I don't know. It's fascinating to me. One of my favorite ones, and I was telling you about this. I own this one in particular, along with Metropolis, is Passion of Joan of Arc. That one's, to me, really really hits what I was talking about earlier, where it gets the visuals so right that it makes you buy into this world and buy into this film without the dialogue, without the sound. Though, another little tangent here, silent films actually aren't meant to be watched in complete silence. They are crafted with the knowledge in mind that you are either going to be hearing the projector clicks, the whir of a projector, or there would be a symphony playing in the actual theater back in the 20s and earlier. So there's kind of these elitists who claim that you shouldn't watch them with like the soundtracks that people add to them like later on, because that's not how they were. That's not how they're preserved in a way, and I completely disagree with that, because again, they were meant to be viewed with an orchestra, with a projector, were with some sort of ambiance of noise. It's very awkward to just sit down and watch a completely silent film.
Yeah, with no music. That's one reason I think I may still have a copy of it. I may have given it away, but when I had VHS tapes, I had a great version of Nosferatu, which had music like you'd think you would have listened to like in the 20s. But the DVD version that I replaced it with has this sort of synthetic score on it, and it's like this isn't right. It just doesn't, doesn't work. And so I watched like half of it and quit. And so I need to probably find myself a better version of Nosferatu, because I really like that movie, but it needs the right kind of music behind it too.
Yeah. There is some score. I will say that there are some scores that don't work, or they feel disingenuine because of the fact that it is like a synth score, and you're like, this was made in the 20s. I don't think this is how that would have been, because I think Metropolis, while a synth score would suit that, I think there is a version with a more synth sounding score. It feels wrong because it was something made long before the synth was ever even conceived.
I could think if you were talented, maybe you could compose music that, with synthesizers and things for that movie, possibly, if you knew what you were doing with music and everything.
Yeah.
But yeah, for the most part, it just doesn't seem to work with these kind of movies.
Definitely. Yeah, I don't know. Metropolis is a difficult one in particular because there's so many different versions of it. And that's because over the last 100 years, we've found, it's not actually been 100 years, I don't think, but just about.
Almost.
Yeah. We keep finding more and more footage that was lost from it. And right now, the most complete version that we're probably ever going to get, I think, was finished in around 2000 something or the 90s. And that is still missing 2 plot important scenes that they have to put little descriptions about what happened in the scene in between the other scenes. And that goes back to the whole discussion about how they did face censorship in a lot of cases, and they did face there wasn't this concept of film preservation, or they were considered too long, because Metropolis was almost 3 hours long when it first released in Germany, I think. But then whenever they brought it over to America, they chopped it to 90 minutes, 80 or 90 minutes, because they thought that audiences wouldn't have the patience for that. And currently, I think the one that we've got basically complete is about 200 or 2 hours, 2.5 hours, somewhere around that time. And another one, which I talked about earlier, was Passion of Joan of Arc. I think that one, all of its scenes have been found, but that was another one because of its subject matter of being about Joan of Arc, and there's a lot of religious subject matter in that. It did face a lot of censorship depending on where it was released. Fun fact that for some reason just popped in my brain, that movie contains a real bleeding of an actress. They used a stunt actress for it, but the director wanted it to look real, and they didn't really have they didn't have the makeup at the time to pull that kind of an effect off. So they got a medical professional to safely bleed a woman into a pan for a scene. And I remember when I first watched it, I knew instantly that was not an effect. And there is a quality about real violence that clicks something in your brain whenever you see it, where you're like, that's real. That's not imaginary. And I had to pause the movie and search online to find out if that was real or not. And it turns out that, yeah, the director really wanted to capture that because they were, making this in a period where they thought that bleeding people get rid of the crazy in your brain.
This is also the period before antibiotics. So
Yeah.
if the person bleeding you gives you an infection, you're really risking your life for your role, and you're just a stunt double.
Yeah.
It's dedication.
Yeah.
But then they used to use real guns too, and use sharpshooters behind the camera to, until I know it was Randolph C. Scott, but it might have been somebody else who then said, "I'm not standing in front of a gun, forget it." And so they filmed the scene without him, and if he had been standing there, he would have been killed because the sharpshooter apparently wasn't that good a sharpshooter. So, yeah, the filming was a lot different.
You could get away with a lot more of abusing your employees, essentially, your actors, your stuntmen. Even up until like the 80s, you could get away with a lot more than you could now. What Stanley Kubrick put like Shelley Duvall through in The Shining is deplorable. But at the same time, those kind of directors who are like your like almost crazy, I have a vision and I'm going to get it, you wonder, was it worth that kind of strain? Because The Shining ended up being considered like a classic and a masterpiece by most people. Not at the time when it was released. That was kind of like The Thing, in a sense, where it released and didn't get favorable reviews, and then a cult following kind of propped it up until eventually people kind of realized, oh wait, no, this is actually pretty good. I've yet to see The Shining. I shouldn't be saying that it's pretty good, because I'm just saying common opinion is that it's pretty good.
It makes a lot of top 10 lists.
Yeah. I was making that same mistake lately about one of my favorite directors, Denis Villeneuve, where I kept saying, well, Sakara is pretty good, and then I go, well, from what I hear, and then I finally watched it and I was like, yeah, it's good. But no, I've got this whole list essentially of films that I plan to watch or want to watch. And it goes back to the 1920s is where it starts, and it's fascinating just to go back and watch these films from just a completely different era and seeing the evolution, like how far we've come in a sense, from what was essentially just stage plays being recorded and into what we have now, which are like, you couldn't do any of that practically, like what they do with the Avengers films. Like, though that scale and that those battles couldn't really translate well to a stage, whereas most of your silent era films, for the most part, could have been done on stage. There's a couple, like your great train robberies, those kinds, that would have been very difficult. Metropolis would have been pretty difficult to pull off as well because of that flooding scene.
Well, even just the number of sets you would need.
Yeah.
I do show sometimes the first 7 or 8 minutes of Metropolis to my students to show them what, say, someone in 1920, when they're thinking of the future, what kind of technology do they think people will have? And, we have all like flying vehicles and these huge skyscrapers. And some things they really seem to pick up on, and other things not so much. Even in the 60s, no one seemed to see the personal computer coming. Because everybody uses a mainframe to run their whole civilization in all those 50s and 60s movies, and so you like trip one wire and you blow the mainframe and the whole civilization goes to pot. But the things like Metropolis are seeing all these, the haves and the have-nots, and just to see those shots of the have-nots marching to and from their jobs and things, are very well constructed, and necessarily do anything better today.
Yeah, that's definitely, Metropolis speaks to several generations, because we do still struggle with, like you were saying, the haves and the have-nots. We still struggle with that, and I think that's like a testament for a lot of your silent films, is whenever they do manage to still be relevant, even if it's in an upsetting way, because it's upsetting that Metropolis is still relevant in a sense. But That's very interesting, and that's what makes film, in my opinion, is how it speaks to people and how it gets a reaction. That's what's fascinating about film for me, and why I keep watching various movies, and I watch the behind the scenes, and I watch them with commentaries, because I'm interested in how all of this fake stuff managed to get like an emotional reaction out of me in some sort of way. Like, I've only cried at like 2 films. I can admit that. And that was like A Ghost Story and The Arrival, actually, which was recently. And I'm sitting there, and they're fake. It's all an illusion. None of it is a real thing that's actually happening. And yet they managed to make me emotional. How and why? I then want to rewatch the movie and analyze, well, what did it do in order to get me to feel this way about these purely fictitious beings? And that just media in general is very fascinating. By being
We're very visual creatures, and so just watching like others in pain, if we have normal brain chemistry, should affect you somehow. And one of those things that I don't like necessarily, like slasher films and stuff. I like horror, but not that particular style of horror, because it's like, there's always some remote chance I could end up being, knifed to death by some crazy person. But but watching the more creepy stuff gets you in, because you don't necessarily see it, and you're sort of dependent on vision. And there's weird sounds, or there's a mist, or you don't really know what's in the distance. It's sort of shadowy, but you can't quite see it. And that's really disturbing when we're creatures that really need to see, to absorb most of the information that we get.
Well, it's fear of the unknown. Fear of the unknown is typically considered to be one of the greatest fears of anyone, the most common anyway. That is a, not necessarily tribal, but it's an instinct that has hit everyone at some point in their life. Mm-hmm. And to go back to the topic at hand, Nosferatu and Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, even that Frankenstein thing, they tackle that idea that, this is something unfamiliar to us. This is something unknown. And so how does it affect the humans in the story, and how does it affect the audience? Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Okay. So any final thoughts on silent movies?
I almost anytime I'm on your show, I basically wrap up with saying, give these things a shot. Mm-hmm. Even if you don't think you're particularly going to be into it, do at least try. Even just try with like the shorter ones. Like I said, that Frankenstein one, it's like 13 minutes. Great Train Robbery is about the same length. Just to get a historical idea to like educate yourself if you're interested in film or interested in history, to just sit down and just watch a couple of these. You might not like them, you might love them. You don't know until you try.
All right. Thanks for joining us again. Remember, if you like this, hit like and the subscribe button and the bell notification so you know when I put up more videos, and we'll see you next time. See ya.